Glory to Jesus Christ. So there's a reason that some Catholics make a very controversial comparison between the Society of St. Pius X and the sovereign citizen movement. They are not saying the SSPX rejects the existence of the Pope. They're not saying SSPX has the same beliefs as some kind of political movement. The comparison is much more specific. It's about authority. The question is simple. What happens when someone says, I recognize your authority, but I will decide when your authority applies? That's the concern raised by SSPX's critics. SSPX affirms the papacy, it acknowledges the Pope, and it rejects the idea that the papal office has disappeared. But critics argue that when papal authority is exercised in a way that the SSPX believes conflicts with tradition, SSPX reserves the right to reject that exercise of authority, and critics say that creates a serious problem. Because if the Pope can issue a decision and a group beneath the Pope can decide whether that decision is truly legitimate, then who is actually functioning as the final judge? The Pope? Or the group evaluating the Pope? And that's the heart of the criticism. Catholicism has always taught that the Church isn't merely an invisible collection of people who share beliefs. Christ established a visible church, a church with priests, bishops, a supreme pontiff, and authority to teach and govern. The critics' concern is that SSPX effectively creates a second court of appeal. Rome makes a decision, SSPX examines it, compares it against its understanding of tradition, and determines whether Rome has acted properly. From the critics' perspective, that changes the relationship between authority and obedience. The authority is no longer simply received, it is reviewed, filtered, and placed under examination. And this is where the sovereign citizen comparison comes from. Sovereign citizen might say, I recognize the Constitution, I recognize the existence of courts, but I personally decide when a court has exceeded its authority. The Catholic critic argues that SSPX follows a similar pattern. I recognize the Pope, I recognize the Church, but I personally decide when the Pope has exceeded his authority. Again, the issue is not whether the comparison is perfect. It's whether the structure of reasoning is similar. Who has the final interpretive authority? The office established by Christ, or those who claim to know when that office has gone too far? Now, SSPX supporters reject this criticism. They say that obedience isn't blind, they say that no authority, even papal authority, is unlimited, and they argue that Catholic tradition itself is the standard by which new developments must be judged. Their position isn't the Pope has no authority, their position is the Pope has authority, but that authority cannot contradict the faith handed down by the Church. That's the disagreement. Critics respond, fine, but who decides whether a contradiction has occurred? Because that question can't be avoided. If every individual, group, or movement can declare that an authority has exceeded its limits, then practical authority moves away from the office itself and toward the person making the judgment. And critics argue that this is precisely the danger. Not an outright rejection of authority, something more subtle. A recognition of authority in theory while reserving the final decision in practice. That's why the analogy provokes strong reactions. Supporters of SSPX hear an unfair accusation of rebellion. Critics hear a warning about the collapse of authority. At the center of the debate is one question. When there is a conflict between a person's interpretation of tradition and the judgment of the Church's legitimate authorities, who gets the final word? That question is bigger than SSPX. It's a question about the very nature of Catholicism.